The blade is already in her hand, not trembling, not hesitating. Outside, boots crush snow. Inside, a child is crying. The door shudders under a heavy blow, open in the name of the law. The words slice through the cold air before the wood does. Margaret Garner does not answer. She stands in the center of a small upstairs room in a house on Mill Creek Road, Cincinnati. The 27th of January, 1856. The Ohio River is still frozen behind them. The same river she crossed hours earlier, believing she had outrun slavery. Her youngest daughter, Mary, is in her arms, 2 years old. Alive for now, another crash against the door downstairs. Robert is holding it as long as he can. Voices bark orders. Metal scrapes against wood. Federal marshals, slave catchers. Men backed by the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, the law that says Margaret is not a woman in flight. She is property in motion, and property must be returned. Mary is crying harder now. The older children press into the corner, confusion spreading across their faces. They do not understand federal statutes. They do not understand interstate slave recovery. They understand fear. Margaret moves quickly. The knife is not ceremonial. It is the kitchen blade from downstairs. Its handle is worn smooth from use. It smells faintly of meat and ash. Another crash, wood splinters, a shout from Robert. Snow gusts through broken panels. They are inside. The room fills with men and cold air. And in that split second, before hands can grab her, Margaret makes her choice. The blade flashes once sharp, precise. Mary's cry stops mid-breath. The silence that follows is heavier than the winter outside. One of the older children screams. Another is wounded. Margaret had tried to kill them all, according to testimony later given in court, but she did not have time. The marshals rush forward. Robert is restrained. A man wrenches the knife from her hand. But Margaret does not collapse. She stands upright. Mary lies at her feet, her small body still. Blood darkens the floorboards. Witnesses will later say Margaret looked calm, not wild, not raving, resolved. She is reported to have said she would rather see her children dead than return to slavery. Those words will echo across newspapers, across courtrooms, across decades. An enslaved mother who killed her own child to save her from bondage. The men who entered that room had come to retrieve property. Instead, they found a mother who had destroyed what the law claimed it owned. And in that moment, something breaks far beyond that house. Because if Margaret is property, how did property decide? If she is an object under law, how did she choose death over chains? The marshals bind her. Robert struggles, shouting her name. The surviving children are crying. Snow blows through the shattered doorway, touching blood on the floor as if trying to erase it. Outside, neighbors gather. Word spreads quickly in Cincinnati. An enslaved woman has killed her child rather than be taken back to Kentucky. Abolitionists are alerted. Slave catchers demand immediate return. And the city, already tense under the Fugitive Slave Act, begins to stir. But before you decide who Margaret Garner is, before you call her monster or martyr, before you pass judgment from the safety of distance, you need to understand something. This did not begin in that room. It did not begin with the blade. It began years earlier, on a plantation in Kentucky, in a system that told a mother her children were not hers. The blood on that floor was not sudden madness. It was the final line in a long lesson, and Margaret had been studying that lesson since the day she was born. Welcome to unrecorded histories they tried to bury. If you've just stumbled onto this channel, you are not here by accident. You are here because some stories refuse to stay hidden. Because some histories were trimmed down until they felt neat, until they no longer disturbed anyone. This is where we sit with the uncomfortable ones. The stories whispered in corners, the truths softened in textbooks, the names mentioned briefly, then moved past quickly. Here we do not move quickly. Tonight we are stepping into one of the most controversial and heartbreaking chapters of American slavery history. The true story of Margaret Garner, the enslaved mother who killed her child to save her from slavery. Stay with me. By the end of this story, you will understand why abolitionists defended her, why slaveholders feared her, and why her case forced America to confront a question it could not easily answer. As you listen, tell me where you're watching from. History does not belong to one state, one country, one people. Drop your city below. Let this story travel farther than chains ever did. Now let us go back before the snow, back before Cincinnati, back to Kentucky. Because what happened in that room was not born in a moment, it was forged over years. And the forging began the day Margaret opened her eyes into a world where her body was already owned. Boone County, Kentucky. Around 1833, no church bell marked her birth. No parchment recorded her arrival with careful ink and blessing. Her name was entered somewhere, but not in celebration. It was entered in a ledger. Archibald Gaines. That is the name history remembers. A white farmer in Boone County, land, tobacco, livestock, respectable in his county. A man with assets. Among those assets were human beings. Margaret was one of them. Under American chattel slavery, the law was simple and merciless. The condition of the child followed the condition of the mother. If your mother was enslaved, you were enslaved. It did not matter who your father was. It did not matter what blood ran through you. It did not matter if your skin carried the pale trace of the master's own face. You were property, and Margaret grew up inside that fact. She did not learn it from books. She learned it from absence, from watching people vanish, from seeing a man she called uncle loaded onto a wagon and sold south, from hearing her mother's breath hitch in the night when rumors of sale drifted through the quarters. The plantation was not chaos. It was order. That was its cruelty. Morning bells, field assignments, supervision, measured productivity, measured bodies, measured obedience. The quarters were small and close. Smoke from cooking fires clung to wooden walls. Laughter existed there, yes, because even in bondage, people laugh, but it was laughter edged with awareness. The big house stood apart, painted, elevated, watching. Margaret would have walked that distance many times from field to house, from shadow to scrutiny, and as she grew older, something else became clear. Enslaved girls did not simply grow up, they became visible. There were no laws protecting enslaved women from sexual violence. Under slavery, a woman's body was not her own to defend. She could not legally accuse a white man of assault. She could not testify against her enslaver. Property could not be violated. Property could only be used. Margaret was described later as light-skinned. So were her children. Historians and court observers at the time quietly noted it. It suggests something that was tragically common in slaveholding societies: the blurring of bloodlines under coercion. It is widely believed that at least some of Margaret's children were fathered by a white man connected to the plantation, possibly even within the Gaines household. That detail is not speculation born of drama. It is inference born of record, description, and the known patterns of the time, which means Margaret grew up knowing two things at once: that she was owned, and that the very system claiming ownership could also claim intimacy without consequence. Imagine learning that lesson before adulthood. Imagine understanding that your body is part of someone else's economy. Margaret married a man named Robert Garner. Marriage under slavery was not recognized by law. It could be broken at any time by sale, but in the quarters, vows were made anyway. People formed unions in the only ways available to them. Margaret and Robert began building a family, 4 children, 4 living reasons to endure. But here is the cruelty sharpened to its point. Those children did not legally belong to Margaret. Under Kentucky law, they were the property of Archibald Gaines. They could be sold, separated, used as leverage. Their worth measured in dollars, not devotion. Motherhood under slavery was not softness, it was vigilance. You watched your children grow with one eye always on the possibility of sale. You loved knowing love could be weaponized against you. Margaret would have seen children taken, would have heard auctioneers call out ages like livestock traits, healthy, strong, good breeding stock. The womb itself was a site of production. Children born enslaved were future laborers, future profit, future control. And if her daughters bore her complexion, light, marked by the silent history of exploitation, Margaret would have understood the path waiting for them. Enslaved girls often worked inside the house as they grew older, closer to the master, closer to power, closer to danger. Margaret had walked that ground herself. So when she looked at her daughters, she did not see only innocence. She saw repetition, a script already written. The plantation was not simply a place of forced labor, it was a place of foreknowledge. You could see what would happen next. And as the 1840s turned into the 1850s, the atmosphere across the South shifted. Debates over slavery were no longer quiet. Compromises were being drafted in Washington. The nation was straining. Margaret would not have followed congressional debates, but she would have felt the tension ripple downward. Enslaved people always felt the tightening first. Then came 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act, a law passed as part of a national compromise intended to preserve unity between North and South. But what it did in practice was simple. It extended the reach of slavery. Escaped enslaved people could be captured in free states and returned to their owners. Federal marshals were required to assist. Citizens who helped fugitives could be fined or imprisoned. Even in Ohio, even in Pennsylvania, even in states that did not recognize slavery, the law would hunt you. Margaret would have heard fragments of this through whispers, through overheard conversations, through the shifting posture of white men who suddenly seemed more confident in their authority. If you run, they can still take you back. That knowledge changes everything. It narrows time. Margaret's children were growing. Each year increased their value. Each year tightened the grip of inevitability. Stay and watch the script unfold. Run and risk everything. The Ohio River was not far from Boone County. On clear days, its surface caught sunlight like a blade. On the other side lay Ohio, free soil. The word free carried weight, even if it was incomplete. But by the mid-1850s, freedom north of the river had become contested ground. Crossing meant hope. It also meant pursuit. Margaret understood something that cannot be softened. She had already lost ownership of her body. That was a reality she had been forced to live with. But watching her daughters approach the age where vulnerability sharpened, that was different. That was future, and futures can be interrupted. In January 1856, winter hardened the Ohio River into ice. Not fully safe, not guaranteed, but solid enough. Ice does not recognize law. Ice does not enforce statutes. Ice simply holds until it doesn't. When Margaret stepped onto that frozen surface with her children, she was not chasing comfort. She was chasing interruption, an ending to repetition, a break in inheritance. The crossing was not madness. It was calculation, because she had lived long enough on that plantation to understand what would happen if she did nothing. She had already lost ownership of her own body, but she was not willing to lose ownership of her children's souls. She was not willing to lose ownership of her children's souls. But the world Margaret lived in did not rest on fields and overseers alone. It rested on law, and law, once written, travels farther than any whip. The year was 1850. In Washington, men argued beneath chandeliers and carved ceilings. They spoke of balance, of union, of compromise. The country was splitting along the fault line of slavery, and they were desperate to hold it together. So they drafted what became known as the Compromise of 1850. Buried inside it was something that would reach all the way into Margaret's life. On paper, it looked procedural, legal, administrative. In practice, it changed the geography of hope. Before 1850, if an enslaved person escaped into a free state, there was danger, yes, but also resistance. Northern courts sometimes refused to cooperate with slave catchers. Local juries sometimes sympathized. Communities sometimes protected runaways. Freedom was fragile, but it existed. After 1850, the law tightened. It declared that escaped enslaved people were still property, no matter what state they stood in. It required federal marshals to capture and return them. It commanded citizens to assist in their seizure. It denied the accused the right to testify in their own defense. Imagine that you are dragged into a hearing. A man claims you as his property, and you are not permitted to speak. Your body becomes evidence. Your silence becomes law. There was another detail, quieter, colder. Federal commissioners were paid $10 if they ruled in favor of returning the accused to slavery, $5 if they ruled in favor of freedom. Justice was not blind. It was incentivized. Word of this law did not remain in Washington. It traveled through newspapers, through dinner conversations in plantation houses, through the tightened posture of slaveholders who now felt federally reinforced, and through whispers in the quarters. If you run north, they can still come for you. Margaret would have heard it in fragments. Enslaved people always listened. They gathered news like small pieces of glass, sharp and incomplete, but enough to see a shape. The Ohio River ran not far from Boone County. Stand on the Kentucky bank and look across. On the other side, Ohio, a free state, no legalized slavery, no slave codes, no plantation ownership recognized by state law. It looked close enough to touch, but the Fugitive Slave Act stretched across that river like an invisible bridge for slave catchers. Crossing into Ohio did not erase Kentucky. It did not erase Archibald Games. It did not erase ownership. It only changed the terrain of the chase. Cincinnati, directly across from Kentucky, was already tense by the 1850s. It was a city balanced on the edge of two worlds, abolitionists and businessmen, free black communities and white merchants tied to southern trade. It was also a hunting ground. Slave catchers operated openly there. Free black citizens sometimes lived with papers in their pockets at all times, proof of status in case someone challenged their freedom. Because under the Fugitive Slave Act, accusation alone could be enough to begin proceedings. Margaret would not have read the statute in full, but she would have understood this. The North is not safe, and yet people still ran. Why? Because sometimes a narrow chance is better than certain suffering. Because sometimes even a fragile possibility feels like oxygen. Margaret's children were growing. Each year increased their value as labor. Each year brought her daughters closer to the age where proximity to the big house became more likely. Margaret had seen that path. She knew how it unfolded. The Fugitive Slave Act did not create her fear. It concentrated it. It told her that waiting was not neutral. Waiting meant watching the future harden. The river, in winter, sometimes froze thick enough to walk on. That fact mattered. In January 1856, the cold was severe. Ice sealed stretches of the Ohio River into a solid, pale surface. Water became ground, or at least something close to it. Ice does not recognize federal law. Ice does not honor warrants. Ice simply holds weight until it cracks. Margaret must have looked at that frozen river and understood two things at once. If we cross and are caught, the law will send us back. If we do not cross, the plantation will finish what it started. There was no option without danger. The Fugitive Slave Act turned freedom into a wager. Before 1850, escape was a race against distance. After 1850, escape was a race against the nation itself. The law had federal teeth. Marshals could knock on doors in Ohio. They could break into houses. They could compel citizens to help. The North was no longer refuge. It was contested ground, but contested ground is still ground. And Margaret chose to step onto it. Let me ask you something carefully. If every legal path leads back to chains, if the law itself is designed to return your children to bondage, what does hope look like? Does it look like patience, or does it look like movement? Margaret gathered her children. Robert prepared to move. The decision to run was not reckless. It was calculated against a shrinking timeline. The older her daughters grew, the more visible they became. The more visible they became, the less time she had. When January hardened the river into ice, the window opened. Small, dangerous, temporary, and Margaret stepped toward it knowing the Fugitive Slave Act would follow her like a shadow. The law did not care about rivers. It did not care about winter. It did not care about a mother's fear. It cared about property, and property must be returned. When the marshals pounded on that Cincinnati door weeks later, they were not simply men doing a job. They were the law crossing the river. They were proof that the Fugitive Slave Act had turned the entire nation into a net. Margaret had crossed ice, but the law had not cracked. Freedom was visible across that river, but it was not guaranteed, it was not protected, it was not safe. Freedom wasn't just escape, it was a gamble with death. Freedom wasn't just escape, it was a gamble with death. And on the night Margaret Garner stepped onto the Ohio River, death lay both beneath her feet and behind her back. The cold that January did not whisper, it bit. The air burned the inside of the lungs. Each breath felt sharp, as if the wind carried tiny blades. The river, usually restless and moving, lay frozen in long, pale sheets that caught the moonlight like dull silver. Robert stepped first. He tested the ice with his weight, slow and careful. It groaned, not loudly, but enough to remind them that water still lived beneath. Margaret stood at the Kentucky bank with the children pressed against her skirts. Behind her, Boone County slept. The Gaines plantation lay quiet under frost. Tobacco fields stiff and brittle, the big house dark. It would not stay dark for long. Enslaved families do not disappear unnoticed. She lifted the youngest into her arms, Mary, 2 years old, warm against her chest. The others clung close, shivering not just from cold, but from confusion. They had been woken in darkness, urged into silence, hurried away from everything familiar. Margaret did not look back again. She stepped forward. The first sound beneath her foot was not a crack, just a deep, hollow shift, ice adjusting to weight. Every step across that frozen river was a question. Will this hold? Will the current swallow us before slavery does? The wind cut through their thin winter clothing. Fabric stiffened, fingers numbed. The children stumbled, their small shoes slipping against the slick surface. Robert moved ahead, guiding, listening for weakness in the ice. The river was wide in places, wider than it seemed from shore. Halfway across, the Kentucky bank looked distant. Ohio still farther. In that expanse of frozen water, there was no shelter, only sky, only breath, only risk. But there was something else too, distance. Each step carried them farther from Archibald Gaines, farther from the certainty of sale, farther from the script Margaret had seen unfold too many times. She had watched enslaved families broken apart with no warning, watched children lifted into wagons, watched mothers collapse on frozen ground as traders counted profit. She had learned the truth of the system. Young, love did not protect you. Law did not protect you. Nothing protected you unless you move. The ice shifted again under Robert's foot. A thin crack traced outward like a pale vein. They froze. The wind howled across the open river, flattening sound. For a moment, even the children were silent. Then Robert moved sideways, slow and careful, finding thicker ground. Margaret followed. And there is a kind that walks quietly across frozen water, knowing it may break at any second. Margaret did not shout. She walked. The Ohio bank rose slowly before them. Dark trees and the faint outline of houses beyond free soil. That phrase had traveled through enslaved communities for years. Free soil. It did not mean comfort. It did not mean equality. But it meant no legal recognition of slavery under state law, and sometimes that difference was enough. They reached the Ohio side just before dawn. Margaret's feet burned as warmth tried to return to them. The children cried softly now, exhaustion mixing with relief. Robert turned once to look back at the river. The ice held. Across. The word must have felt like a miracle. They moved quickly toward Cincinnati. The city in winter smelled of smoke and damp wood. Chimneys exhaled gray plumes into the cold air. Horses pulled carts through packed snow. Men hurried past without looking closely at faces. Cincinnati was not neutral ground. It was a border city, a place where abolitionists lived beside businessmen who profited from Southern trade, a place where free black families built lives under constant scrutiny, a place where slave catchers operated openly under federal authority. But it was still not Kentucky. They were taken to a house on Mill Creek Road, owned by a free black family willing to risk everything. Under the Fugitive Slave Act, helping fugitives was a federal crime. Fines could reach $1,000. Imprisonment was possible. But the Underground Railroad was not a train line. It was courage passed from door to door. Inside that small house, warmth wrapped around them for the first time in hours. The children were given blankets. Someone placed food before them. The door closed. Silence. Margaret allowed herself to sit, not collapse. Sit. Mary rested against her chest, breathing softly. The older children huddled together. Robert leaned back against the wall, eyes closed. For a few fragile hours it felt real. They had done it. They had crossed the river. They had interrupted the future. Perhaps someone whispered the word Canada. Canada lay beyond the reach of the Fugitive Slave Act, beyond American jurisdiction. If they could move farther north quickly, perhaps they could vanish into that distance. Hope flickered, thin but alive, yet hope in 1856 did not move alone. Word of their escape had already reached Boone County. Archibald Gaines would have noticed the absence at once. Enslaved labor did not disappear quietly. He had legal right under federal law to pursue them. The Fugitive Slave Act did not require him to wait. Slave catchers were alerted, descriptions circulated. A woman named Margaret Garner, several children. A husband, light-skinned children. Cincinnati stirred. By midday, whispers moved through streets. Men were seen asking questions near Mill Creek Road. Federal marshals were notified. The law had crossed the river. Inside the house, Margaret may have sensed the shift before hearing it, that tightening in the air, that sound of unfamiliar boots on packed snow outside. Robert stood first. The children froze. A knock. Hard, authoritative. Open this door. Margaret's breath slowed, not panicked, not frantic, measured. She understood what was happening. The ice had held, but the law had not cracked. The Fugitive Slave Act had done exactly what it was designed to do. It followed them. Hope had lasted hours, only hours. Only hours. Let me ask you something. If you carry your children across a frozen river believing you have saved them, and the law stands at the door to drag them back. What options remain? The knock became pounding. Wood splintered. Snow blew inward as the door gave way. Men rushed in shouting federal authority. Robert fought. Margaret gathered her children into one room upstairs. The illusion of safe ground shattered completely, because now she knew crossing ice had not ended the danger. It had only delayed it, and delay was no longer enough. The boots were on the stairs, the room was closing. The law was inside, and Margaret's mind moved faster than fear. Hope had cracked. Now only decision remained. The boots are already on the stairs. Wood splinters below. Men shout. Snow blows through the broken door and crawls across the floorboards like something alive. Margaret gathers the children into the back room. There is no more time to measure possibilities. No more ice to cross. No more doors to close. The law is inside the house. Robert's voice rises once, then is swallowed by the struggle downstairs. A heavy thud, a curse, the sharp bark of command. Federal marshals, deputies, slave catchers acting under the authority of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, the same law that said crossing into Ohio would not protect her, the same law that followed her across frozen water. Margaret's mind does not fracture, it sharpens. The children cling to her skirts. Mary, the youngest, reaches upward, confused by the noise. The older ones begin to cry, not from cold now, but from the sound of men forcing their way into a place that had felt, for a few fragile hours, safe. The stairwell creaks. Boots ascending. Margaret looks at her daughters, light-skinned, old enough to be seen soon, old enough to be noticed in the big house, old enough for the repetition to begin. She had already lived the script. She knew how it ended. She had crossed the river to interrupt that ending. Now the interruption was being reversed. What happens when the future you were fleeing stands at the door? The men shout again, "Open up." Margaret does not answer. Instead, she reaches for the knife. It is not ceremonial, not symbolic. It is simply the nearest blade, taken from downstairs when she rushed the children upward. The handle is worn smooth, the edge sharp enough. She does not scream. She does not pace. She does not fall apart. Witnesses will later testify that she seemed composed, determined. One of the older children tries to move toward the door. Margaret pulls them back. The steps are closer now. She knows something that the men climbing those stairs do not. If they take her alive, she will return to Kentucky. If they take the children alive, they will return to Kentucky. Archibald Gaines will reclaim what the law calls his property. And everything she crossed ice to prevent will unfold exactly as she feared: sale exploitation, separation, the repetition of violation disguised as ownership. In that small upstairs room on the 27th of January, 1856, Margaret reaches a conclusion that terrifies even history. If I cannot free them, I will not let them be owned. The door bursts inward. Men flood the room. But Margaret moves first. The blade flashes, once quick. Mary's cry stops mid-breath. The room collapses into noise. One child screams, another is wounded. Margaret had attempted, according to testimony, to kill them all before the men could stop her. A marshal lunges forward. The knife is wrenched from her hand. Robert is forced to the floor. The children are pulled away. Snow gusts through the shattered door and drifts across blood on the floorboards. The room falls into a terrible silence, broken only by sobbing. Mary lies still, 2 years old small, her body positioned not in chaos, but in decision. Margaret stands upright, breathing steady, no frenzy, no hysteria. Later accounts report that she declared she would rather kill her children than see them returned to slavery. Those words spread like fire through Cincinnati, through Kentucky, through newspapers across the country. An enslaved mother killed her child rather than surrender her to bondage. What do you call that? Madness, murder, mercy. The marshals bind her wrists. Robert shouts her name. The surviving children cling to each other in terror. Outside, neighbors gather in the snow. Word spreads faster than the cold. Abolitionists hear first, then slaveholders, then reporters. By the time Margaret is led down those stairs in chains, the story has already begun to divide the nation. Some see a monster. Some see proof of slavery's cruelty. Some see property destroyed. Some see a mother who refused to let the law decide her child's fate. But in that room, in those seconds, none of those labels existed. There was only compression, a life pressed so tightly by law, ownership, an inevitability that it chose rupture. Understand something clearly. Margaret did not deny what she had done. She did not collapse into apology. She did not beg for mercy. Witnesses describe her as calm, almost resolute, as if the decision had already been made long before the blade was lifted, because in many ways it had. It was forged in Boone County, forged in the silence of plantation nights, forged in the knowledge that her daughter's futures were already written in someone else's ledger. When the Fugitive Slave Act followed her across the river, it closed the final door. The crossing of ice had been hope. The rage shattered it, and when hope collapses completely, decision hardens. Let me ask you something carefully. If the law defines your child as property, if every path leads back to chains, if surrender guarantees a future you know too well, what does protection look like? Margaret is taken outside into the freezing air. The blood remains upstairs. Mary's body is carried out separately. Snow falls lightly, settling on rooftops, on shoulders, on the steps where neighbors whisper. The river behind the city remains frozen, unmoving, as if none of this has happened. But something has shifted. The Fugitive Slave Act was designed to enforce order instead. It has exposed fracture, because now the nation must answer a question it has tried to avoid. If slavery is so humane, why would a mother choose death over it? Margaret is placed in custody, charged initially with murder under Ohio law. But the debate begins immediately. Is she a murderer? Or is she property? If she is property, then she cannot legally be tried for murder. If she is a person capable of murder, then she is a person under law. The blade in that room has cut deeper than flesh. It has cut into the structure of American slavery itself, and the trial that follows will force the country to confront something it cannot easily bury. But before we enter the courtroom, before lawyers argue and newspapers rage, sit for a moment in that room, in the cold, in the silence after the cry stops. Because everything that comes next, every legal battle, every headline, every defense, grows out of that single decision. Margaret Garner did not scream when they took her. She did not run. She did not deny. She had done what she believed protection required. Now the nation would decide what to call it. Scene 6. The trial that shook a nation. The blood had barely dried when the arguments began. Margaret Garner sat in a Cincinnati jail cell, wrists bound, the winter air still clinging to her skin. Outside those stone walls, the city did not quiet, it swelled. Because what happened in that upstairs room was no longer private tragedy. It was public crisis. At first, Ohio authorities charged her with murder. That alone was explosive. If Margaret could be tried for murder, then she was being treated as a person under criminal law. But Archibald Gaines moved quickly. He did not want a murder trial. He wanted property returned. Under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, he filed a claim asserting that Margaret, her husband Robert, and the surviving children were his lawful property. And this is where the case fractures into something far larger than one woman. If Margaret was property, she could not legally be guilty of murder. Property does not commit crimes. Property is acted upon, but if she could be tried for murder, then she was being acknowledged as a human being responsible for her actions, and that acknowledgement threatened the foundation of slavery itself. The courtroom filled. Reporters from northern newspapers crowded benches. Abolitionists stood shoulder to shoulder with slaveholders. Free black citizens gathered in tense silence. Because this was no longer just about Margaret, this was about the meaning of personhood. Salmon P. Chase, a prominent Cincinnati lawyer and future Chief Justice of the United States, stepped forward to assist in her defense. Chase was already known for opposing the Fugitive Slave Act. He saw in Margaret's case an opportunity to challenge it directly. He did not defend the killing as moral. He defended the humanity of the woman who committed it. Chase argued that Margaret should be tried for murder in Ohio, not returned under the Fugitive Slave Act. His reasoning cut straight to the heart of the system. If Ohio charged her with murder, then she must first be recognized as a person under Ohio law. And if she is a person under Ohio law, then how can she simultaneously be property under federal law? The courtroom air thickened. Slave catchers stood rigid. Games's legal representatives insisted on immediate enforcement of federal statute. The Fugitive Slave Act required return of escaped property without delay. They argued that the killing itself proved the danger of allowing fugitives to remain in the North. See what happens when you interfere with slave recovery. They framed it not as maternal despair, but as criminal savagery. The judge presiding over the hearing, Commissioner John Pendery, was not deciding moral questions. He was deciding jurisdiction, and the Fugitive Slave Act was clear. Federal authority superseded state obstruction in matters of fugitive recovery. The defense pressed hard. Chase argued that Ohio had the right to prosecute a murder committed on its soil. He pointed out that Margaret had acted within Ohio's borders. If the state had the authority to punish homicide, how could it simply surrender her as property without trial? The tension was no longer contained within that courtroom. Newspapers across the North began publishing headlines. Slave mother kills child rather than return to bondage. The story spread rapidly. Abolitionist circles seized upon it as evidence of slavery's brutality. They asked openly, "What kind of system drives a mother to this?" Southern papers responded with outrage. They framed Margaret as a monster, a warning, proof that enslaved people were dangerous when allowed sympathy. The country leaned forward, and in that jail cell, Margaret waited. Accounts from the time describe her as composed. She did not collapse under scrutiny. She did not retract what she had done. The courtroom proceedings lasted several days. Arguments circled the same impossible axis. Is she property? Or is she a person? If she is property, return her. If she is a person, try her. The law could not comfortably hold both positions at once, but slavery had always depended on that contradiction. Finally, Commissioner Pendery ruled in favor of Archibald Games. The Fugitive Slave Act would be enforced. Margaret, Robert, and the surviving children were to be returned to Kentucky. The murder charge would not proceed in Ohio. Property would be reclaimed. In that decision, something stark was revealed. The federal government chose ownership over personhood. Chase protested. Abolitionists were furious. But the ruling stood. Margaret would not be tried as a woman. She would be returned as property. And yet, even in defeat, something irreversible had happened. Because the question had been asked in public, can property commit murder, and millions had heard it. Margaret was transported under guard back toward Kentucky. Crowds gathered as she was moved, some silent, some openly weeping, some glaring. The river she had crossed days earlier now stood between her and the brief illusion of safety she had touched. This time, she did not walk across ice. she crossed under escort bound. The Fugitive Slave Act had done exactly what it was designed to do. It reached across state lines, it crushed interference, it returned human beings to ownership. But it could not contain the story, because the story was already moving faster than the law across pamphlets, across speeches, across abolitionist meetings. Margaret Garner had become more than a defendant. She had become an argument. Let me ask you something. If a nation insists a mother is property, and that same mother makes a choice only a human being can make, which claim survives? The courtroom had answered in favor of slavery. But the moral fracture remained. Margaret left Cincinnati in chains. Mary was gone. The surviving children clung to her as they were led back toward Kentucky soil. The city watched, some ashamed, some satisfied, some unsettled in ways they could not name. The trial had not freed her. It had not undone the Fugitive Slave Act. But it had exposed something raw. Slavery required people to pretend that mothers were merchandise. Margaret's act made that pretense harder to maintain. As she crossed back toward the south, one truth hung in the winter air heavier than snow.